Hey everybody, it's Miss Bergelson here with my sister's dog Lulu, who's staying with us during this COVID crisis. And I'm keeping her on my lap in hopes that maybe she'll be slightly less yappy than she was in my several previous attempts to make this recording. So I'm here to talk to you about implied line. So my little slide here, I just want to show it without my picture. Okay. Um, you've probably seen this in various optical illusions before, but the same font color, the gray that I used to write implied line right here, is the same one that I used right here. What makes this one look so much lighter and that one so much darker is the background against which they're um, laying. So because this whole slide is, there's my large dog barking in the background, little Lulu here. Because the background itself has this gradation, has this value shift, the text looks very different. And you can see I have this little seesaw here, right? Because I want to show you that one way to create implied line is through value shifts. Let me bring you to the next slide. Come here, little slide. And here I am. Okay, so when you imply something through speaking or through writing, you suggest something, you kind of lead the reader or the listener down this path so that they can understand what you're saying without you coming out and saying it. And that's kind of what happens with implied line in art. So you show edges, you show the edge of something either by a shift in color, which I'm not going to talk about here at all because that's a whole other ball of wax, or through a shift in value or a shift in texture or pattern. And the line can either exist because of that contrast, or the line can just be suggested and your mind kind of fills it in. So the same way if you were writing by a movie marquee, let's say, and some of the letters of the name of the movie were missing, they had fallen off, you could probably still figure out what the title of the movie is because your mind just kind of, your brain fills in that void. And that's kind of what happens with implied line. So if you look at this optical illusion right here, we see this triangle, this inverted triangle, the white one that's aiming down. We see it very clearly, even though it doesn't have an outline, right? We see the contrast of it here. The black makes that corner, and we see the black against the white. So we see that corner, but then our mind just kind of fills in this line along this edge. And it looks almost as if it's there, but it's not. Our mind's reading that. In this photograph, let me take myself away, by Alfred Stieglitz of Georgia O'Keeffe, his wife's hands, you can see that the silhouette of her fingers is very defined here against the back. And that's very much like the talking about positive and negative space like we did in the last assignment. But if you look down here at like the edge of her hand and her wrist and into her shirt, the hand, which is very dark here because it's silhouetted against the light of the window, suddenly, instead of the finger being darker than the background, as the lighting situation shifts, this becomes very, very light on the edge and the background is darker by comparison. So that's what I mean by that kind of seesaw effect, that it's where the contrast exists because where one thing is getting darker, the thing next to it is getting lighter. And where one thing is getting lighter, the thing next to it is getting darker. If that contrast didn't exist, if the seesaw balanced out, then we wouldn't see a line at all. I skipped something. Oopsie. Okay. These images are examples of what we are not doing or what we're not exploring for this project. So these images have direct lines and outlines. It doesn't mean they're not awesome. This is not a judgment call. I love all three of these images, but they're very different than implied line. They're not what we're exploring. So this is the Keith Haring drawing. And if you're familiar with Keith Haring, we talked about him when you were in 6th grade. He has these very stylized drawings that he did where he very much relies on these very heavy outlines that kind of create his visual voice, right? This is a drawing by Picasso. I'm not generally the biggest Picasso fan. I mean, he has his value, but he's not someone that I'm like in love with as an artist. But this drawing is quite lovely. And I wanted to show it to you because you can see how the woman's face laying against her arms, you see that line that shows the edge of the face, right? So he's got these very strong lines here. And then this artist, I just learned about, her name is Chantal Martin. I actually found out about her. She's a contemporary artist. She's British, I think. Um, because I love Brooklyn Nine-Nine, as I may have mentioned. And so I started following Terry Crews on Instagram, and he had a live interview with her the other day. And I watched it and it was really cool, but it hasn't been uploaded to YouTube yet. If it is, I will definitely post it in the enrichment site because I thought her work was really cool and very stylized. And she works really large and she works to music. She does all kinds of cool stuff. But the point is, these are very, very defined lines, right? The only thing that might pass as an implied line is where she has this dotted line here. So you kind of read it as a line, even though it's a series of dots. So again, these are all great drawings, but not implied line. This is not what we're doing. So what are we doing? The examples I'm going to be showing you, like this one, are very much about realism. And that's because I know that's something that we tend to value in art and see as sort of the pinnacle of technical ability. As I've probably mentioned to a lot of you, in my own work, I do a lot of abstraction. I take a lot of the ideas that we're talking about that we're looking at in terms of realism, and I value realism too, but I personally find more satisfaction and sort of space to explore in abstraction. So don't be intimidated because you're looking at stuff that's like, oh my God, this is literally Da Vinci, right? So I'm not expecting you to draw this drawing. I just want to use it to point out some elements of implied line and direct line to you. So this drawing has both implied line and direct line. So there are direct lines like where you see the edge of this woman's face, right, against the background, this 3/4 view of her face. That is very much a line that's defining what the shape of her head against the background. There's a line here that shows us where her nose, right, is popping out and that cheek is receding there. On her eyelids, on her iris, there are very much direct lines. But there are also implied lines in here. So where her hairline would be, he didn't put in every single line, and we don't, think that she's suddenly becoming bald. It's just kind of like, oh, the head. We're just like, oh, that the drawing's kind of opening up there. It's a loose sketch, and he didn't put in all of those lines. Down here, where her lip ends, um, over on this edge, there's no line there showing us like, oh, this is where the lipstick would go, right? It's just kind of flowing. There's a very subtle shift in value that creates that implied line, the edge of her lip. And the same thing here with her tear ducts here, like the inside corner of her eye. Uh, Rather than it being a line, there's all this shadow here, and that line is actually created by erasing, right? Or by not putting marks there at all. So that kind of highlight, the light line there of the corner of the eye exists in contrast to the darker area behind it. So let